The dust of Redemption Gulch is a character in itself. It's a fine, pale powder the color of bone, and it settles on everything with biblical finality. It coats the tongues of the righteous and the damned alike. Today, it clings to the black wool of Alara's dress, a garment ill-suited for the hammer of the late summer sun. She stands outside the general store, a ghost in the stark daylight, her gaze fixed on a loose board in the porch floor. She's trying to make herself small, to fold into the very shadows that the unforgiving sun seeks to erase. But a woman in her condition cannot be small. Her condition is, in fact, the entire problem. The whispers are not whispers at all. They are stones thrown with careful aim. Fallen, right from the arms of the Lord, the voice belongs to Martha Miller, the preacher's wife, a woman whose piety is as sharp and thin as a shard of glass. And landed right in the devil's lap. Seems to me. Another chimes in, followed by a dry titter of laughter that scratches at the air. Alara's hands, hidden in the folds of her skirt, clench into fists. The knuckles are white. She feels the faint butterfly flutter deep within her womb, and a wave of fierce, desperate protectiveness washes over her. This is why she endures. For this secret, sacred life. She had once worn a wimple that shielded her face from the world. Now, she feels as if her skin has been flayed away, leaving every nerve exposed to the town's collective glare. Her vows are a ruin, her past a public spectacle. The mockery is a constant sermon on her failure. Across the street, leaning against the shadowed wall of the smithy, a man watches. He is a fixture in Redemption Gulch, yet not a part of it. Silas Thorne. The town knows him as the chaplain who went to war and came back wrong. He carries the war in the rigid set of his shoulders, in the slight, persistent tremor of his left hand, and in the hollows of his eyes that have seen too much of man's work to trust in God's plan. He's heard the talk. The fallen nun, he's seen her moving through town like a phantom, enduring the barbs with a stillness that he, of all people, recognizes. It is the stillness of a soldier hunkering down under cannon fire, waiting for the barrage to end. Today, the barrage is escalating. Martha Miller, emboldened by her audience, takes a step closer to Alara. The house of God is a sacred place, not a brothel for the faithless. You shame us all with your presence. Alara flinches, a barely perceptible tightening of her jaw. She does not look up. She will not give them her eyes. She will not give them her tears. Silas pushes himself off the wall. The movement is slow, deliberate, each motion seeming to cost him something. He crosses the dusty street, his limp more pronounced than usual. The jingle of his spurs is a lonely sound against the sudden hush that falls over the women. Their vicious sport is interrupted. The war-torn chaplain is approaching, and no one is ever quite sure what he will do. He stops not in front of the coterie of judges, but beside the accused. He doesn't look at her, not at first. His gaze sweeps over Martha Miller and her cronies, a flat, unreadable look that is somehow more unnerving than open anger. He has seen women like this before, picking over the dead and the dying on battlefields, not for salvation but for scraps. "Ma'am," he says, his voice a low rumble like distant thunder. It's the voice he used to use over shallow graves, rough and resonant with things better left unsaid. Martha Miller puffs up, her self-righteousness a shield. "Mr. Thorne, this is a matter for decent folk. It does not concern you." "You are mistaken," Silas says, his voice dropping even lower, cutting through the heat. "It does." He then turns his head, just enough to look down at the top of Alara's bowed head. She can feel the heat of his presence, a stark contrast to the cold malice of the others. He sees the fine tremors running through her shoulders. He sees the worn fabric of her dress, the desperate dignity in her posture. He sees a soul under siege. And with a certainty that feels like the first true thing he has felt since the guns fell silent, he knows what he must do. He extends his scarred, trembling left hand. The town holds its breath. He is offering his hand to the pariah, the sinner, the fallen nun. Alara slowly lifts her head. Her eyes, the color of a stormy sea, are wide with a mixture of fear and bewilderment. They are filled with a pain so profound it makes his own ghost stir in recognition. She stares at his hand, at the faint scars that cross his knuckles, at the tremor he cannot conceal. It is an imperfect hand, a human hand. And as the gasps ripple through the crowd, the war-torn chaplain takes the fallen nun's hand, his voice a low rumble that cut through the hate. She will walk with me. That was a close call. Before we see how our hero navigates this, tell us in the comments, what's the toughest situation you've ever had to survive? And if you admire pure grit, hit that like button and subscribe. His fingers, calloused and warm, closed around hers. It was not a gesture of romance or even of familiarity. It was an act of claiming, a public declaration of alliance that sent a shockwave through the assembled women. Alara's hand was cold, her fingers limp in his grasp for a moment before a flicker of strength, of desperate purchase, returned to them. She held on. He did not pull her or guide her. He simply stood with her, his presence a bulwark, his hand a surprising anchor in the swirling tide of contempt. Martha Miller's face, a moment before flushed with righteous victory, was now mottled with disbelief and fury. Mr. Thorne, have you taken leave of your senses? You would align yourself with this woman? A blasphemer. Silas's eyes, which had been fixed on Alara, slowly lifted back to Martha. They were pale, the color of a winter sky, and held no warmth at all. I've sat with boys of 17 while they bled out in the mud, Mrs. Miller. I've heard their last words. I've learned the difference between sin and suffering. You would do well to do the same. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The quiet authority in his tone, born of horrors she could not imagine, silenced her more effectively than any shout could have. He had invoked the war, the town's great, unspoken wound, and in doing so, had claimed a moral high ground they could not assail. He had been there. They had not. He had seen what God saw in the darkest hours, and they had only seen the inside of their pristine, airless church. Without another word, he turned his grip on Alara's hand firm and steady now. He began to walk, leading her away from the general store, away from the venomous stares. Alara moved as if in a trance, her feet finding their rhythm beside his uneven gait. The dust rose in little puffs around their boots. They walked past the blacksmiths, past the saloon where a few curious faces peered out from the swinging doors, and toward the edge of town, where the mean little houses gave way to open country. She did not know this man. She knew of him, as everyone in Redemption Gulch did. Silas Thorne had been the son of the previous preacher, a fervent, bright-eyed boy sent off to war with a Bible in his pack to save the souls of the Union. He had returned 4 years later, a changed creature. His father was dead, his mother gone to live with family back east, and the church had been taken over by the stern Reverend Miller. Silas had claimed his father's small, neglected plot of land a few miles out of town and had kept to himself ever since. He was a ghost of a different sort than Alara, a ghost of the town's own making, a reminder of a patriotism that had curdled into trauma. They pitted him, feared him, and mostly they left him alone. Until now. The walk was silent. The sun beat down, and the only sounds were their footsteps and the distant clang of the smith's hammer. Alara's mind, which had been a maelstrom of shame and fear, was now a stunned, quiet void. She was intensely aware of his hand holding hers. It was the first human touch she'd experienced in months that wasn't a jostle or a shove. The last hands to hold hers with any tenderness had belonged to a man who had promised her the world and then vanished when that world began to grow inside her. Silas's homestead was little more than a cabin, a leaning barn, and a few acres of stubborn-looking land carved out of the prairie. A scrawny horse watched them approach from a small corral, its tail flicking at flies. The place had an air of profound solitude, of a man who had intentionally walled himself off from the world. And now he was bringing the world's judgment right to his doorstep. He led her to the cabin's porch and finally released her hand. The absence of his touch was as jarring as its presence had been. He gestured to a simple wooden bench beside the door. Seat. Alara sat. Her legs felt weak. She watched as he went to the water pump, his movements economical and practiced. He worked the handle until water gushed out, clear and cold. He filled a tin dipper and brought it to her. She took it with both hands, her fingers trembling slightly. The water was metallic and wonderful. She drank it all, the coolness a balm to her parched throat. He took the dipper back and stood before her, his shadow falling over her. He was tall, leaner than she'd realized, his frame all sharp angles under a worn cotton shirt. A scar, thin and white, cut a path from the corner of his right eye into his hairline. It was the mark everyone whispered about, the one they said had let the devil in. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. It was the only word she could manage. Why help her? Why invite this trouble? Silas looked out over his land, his gaze distant. The tremor in his hand had started again, and he subtly pressed it against his thigh to still it. "Because I know what it is to be judged by people who thank God they are not you." His answer was so direct, so devoid of pity, that it startled her. He wasn't offering charity. He was offering recognition. He saw her not as a fallen woman, but as a fellow exile. Her story was a simple, brutal one. She had entered the convent at 16, seeking refuge from a harsh world and solace in quiet devotion. For years, she had found it. The cool stone walls, the rhythm of the prayers, the scent of beeswax and old incense. It had been her sanctuary. But silence can be a breeding ground for doubt as much as for faith. A crisis bloomed in her heart, a yearning for the world she had renounced. With the blessing of a kind mother superior who saw the truth in her eyes, she had left the order. Not fallen, but walked away, seeking a different kind of life. She had found work as a governess in a town 100 miles east. She had met a man, a charming surveyor with promises in his eyes. She had believed him. She had given him her heart, and in a moment of weakness and profound loneliness, she had given him what remained of her innocence. The promise of marriage had dissolved into air the moment she'd told him about the baby. He was gone the next morning, penniless and with nowhere else to turn. She had used her last dollars to travel to Redemption Gulch, where a distant cousin she'd never met was supposed to live. She had arrived to find the cousin had died of fever 6 months prior. And so she was stranded, her past as a nun discovered and twisted into a weapon against her, her present a nightmare of shame and slow starvation. Silas Thorne knew none of these details. He only knew what he saw, a woman being torn apart by sanctimonious wolves. He finally looked back at her, his expression grim. "The nights are getting cold. You can have the cot inside. I'll take the barn." It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. He had brought her here, and he was now responsible for her. The thought was both terrifying and a profound relief. "I have nothing," she said, her voice stronger now. "I cannot pay you." "I'm not asking for payment," he replied, his tone sharp, as if the notion offended him. He turned and walked into the cabin, leaving the door open behind him. It was an invitation. For a long moment, Alara remained on the bench, the tin dipper still cool in her hands. She looked back in the direction of the town, a smudge of wood and hypocrisy on the horizon. Then she looked at the open door of the small, lonely cabin. One was a slow death. The other was an unknown. Taking a deep breath that felt like her first in a very long time, she stood up and walked inside. The cabin was one room, spare and meticulously clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. A narrow cot with a thin mattress and a neatly folded blanket was against another. There was a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a dry sink, and a few shelves holding tins of food, a handful of books, and a Bible. It was the home of a man who owned little and wanted less. It was a fortress of solitude, and she just breached its walls. That evening, they ate in silence. Silas had prepared a simple stew of potatoes and salted pork. It was the most substantial meal Alara had eaten in weeks, and she had to force herself to eat slowly, to not betray the gnawing hunger that had been her constant companion. He ate with a soldier's efficiency, his gaze focused on his plate. The quiet was not entirely uncomfortable. It was a practical silence, the quiet of 2 strangers navigating a fragile truce. When they were finished, he stood. "There are extra blankets in that chest," he said, gesturing with his chin toward a wooden trunk at the foot of the cot. "The door has a bolt. Use it." He didn't wait for a reply. He took his jacket from a peg by the door and walked out, closing it softly behind him. A few moments later, Alara heard the groan of the barn door opening and then closing. She was alone. She went to the door and slid the heavy wooden bolt into place. The sound was loud in the small cabin, a definitive thunk of separation and safety. She walked to the cot and sat down, the thin mattress sighing under her weight. Her hand went to her belly, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. For the first time since arriving in this godforsaken town, she did not feel entirely alone in her fear. A strange, war-torn man had drawn a line in the dust and placed her on his side of it. She didn't understand why, not really. But as she lay down on the cot, pulling a rough wool blanket over her, a single, startling tear escaped and traced a path through the dust on her cheek. It was not a tear of sorrow or of shame, but a fragile, terrifying thing she hadn't dared to feel for months: gratitude. The first days at Silas's homestead settled into a quiet, unspoken rhythm. He rose before the sun, his movements quiet as he stoked the embers in the fireplace and put a pot of coffee on a boil. By the time Alara emerged from the cabin, he would already be at work, mending a fence post or tending to his horse, Jerusalem. He left a portion of whatever he'd made for breakfast on the table for her, usually biscuits or oatmeal. He asked nothing of her, but Alara could not bear idleness. It felt too much like charity, and her pride, though battered, was not broken. She began by tidying the cabin, a task that took little time given its Spartan nature. She washed their few dishes, swept the floor, and aired out the blankets. She found a small, neglected vegetable patch behind the cabin, choked with weeds. She recognized remnants of what had once been rows of beans and squash. Drawing on the skills she'd learned in the convent's sprawling gardens, she began to reclaim it. Her hands, soft from years of prayer and indoor work, were quickly chapped and blistered, but the physical labor was a relief. It grounded her, gave her a purpose beyond merely surviving the day. Silas watched her from a distance. He'd see her on her knees in the dirt, her brow furrowed in concentration as she pulled weeds, her movements gentle as she coaxed life from the dry soil. He never commented, but one afternoon, he left a pair of his old work gloves on the porch railing. They were far too big for her, but she wore them, the leather worn soft and smelling faintly of him, of earth and sweat. It was a conversation without words, an acknowledgement. Their first trip back into Redemption Gulch was a necessity. Silas was low on flour and salt, and Alara needed thread to mend her thinning dress. The prospect filled her with a cold dread, but Silas was matter of fact. "We'll leave after sunrise," was all he said. He brought the wagon around, the old horse Jerusalem looking as impassive as his owner. Alara climbed onto the hard wooden seat, her hands clenched in her lap. As they neared the town, she could feel the familiar tension coiling in her stomach. She braced herself for the whispers, the stares. They came as soon as they tethered the wagon outside the general store. The silence that fell as they stepped onto the porch was louder than any shout. People stopped their conversations, turning to watch. It was different this time, however. The mockery was gone, replaced by a wary, resentful curiosity. Silas Thorne, their resident ghost, had taken a side. His action had given them pause. Inside the store, Mr. Henderson, a balding man with nervous eyes, fidgeted behind the counter. "Silas," he mumbled, not quite meeting his eye. He pointedly ignored Alara. Silas began listing his needs in his low, even voice. 50 pounds of flour, 10 of salt, a sack of coffee beans. As Henderson weighed out the flour, Martha Miller swept into the store. She stopped dead when she saw them, her face pinching as if she'd smelled something foul. She stared at Alara, her gaze traveling pointedly to the slight swell of her belly, which the dark wool dress could no longer completely conceal. "Well," she said, her voice dripping with disdain, "I see the serpent has found a new garden to infest." Alara froze, the spool of black thread in her hand suddenly heavy. The heat of shame washed over her, hot and suffocating. Before she could retreat into herself, Silas moved. He placed his body partially between her and Mrs. Miller, a subtle, protective shift. He set a small tin of kerosene on the counter with a firm thud. The good book also says, "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone." "Martha," Silas said, his voice dangerously calm, "I seem to recall your husband's sermons being quite fond of that one. Or does it only apply when the stones aren't in your hand?" Mr. Henderson dropped his flour scoop. Martha Miller's mouth opened and closed like a fish. She was accustomed to being the arbiter of morality in this town, her husband's position granting her an unassailable authority. To be so publicly rebuked, and by the war-haunted chaplain no less, left her momentarily speechless. Silas paid Henderson, his movements unhurried. He gathered their supplies, his scarred hand brushing Alara's as he took the spool of thread from her and placed it in the sack. "Let's go," he murmured. They walked out of the store and back into the sunlight, leaving a stunned silence in their wake. The trip back to the homestead was as quiet as the ride in, but the quality of the silence had changed. The tension was gone, replaced by something else. Alara kept replaying the scene in her mind. He had defended her, not just with his presence, but with his words. He had used their own weapon, their scripture, against them. That night, a storm rolled in from the west. The sky turned a bruised purple, and the wind howled around the small cabin like a hungry animal. Rain lashed against the single window pane. Alara sat at the table, mending a tear in one of Silas's shirts, her stitches small and neat. Silas was by the fire, cleaning his rifle, the metallic clicks and scrapes a rhythmic counterpoint to the storm. A sudden, violent crack of thunder shook the cabin, and the lamp on the table flickered wildly. Alara jumped, dropping the shirt. In the flickering light, she saw Silas was no longer by the fire. He was on his feet, his back pressed against the wall, his eyes wide and unfocused, staring at the window as if he could see through the rain to something terrible beyond. His breath was coming in ragged gasps. The rifle lay forgotten on the floor. "Silas?" she said softly. He didn't respond. His left hand was trembling violently, no longer a slight tremor but a full-body shudder. His gaze was fixed on the darkness. He was not in the cabin. He was somewhere else, somewhere loud and full of fire and death. He was back in the war. Alara's first instinct was fear. This was the madness the town whispered about. But then she saw the raw terror on his face, the vulnerability of a man completely lost in a memory. Her fear was replaced by a surge of compassion so strong it took her breath away. She knew what it was to be haunted. She rose slowly from her chair. "Silas," she said again, her voice calm and steady, the way the Mother Superior used to speak to frightened novices. "It's just the storm. It's only rain." She moved toward him, not reaching out, not wanting to startle him further. She stopped a few feet away. "You are in your home. You are safe here." Another clap of thunder, closer this time, rattled the very foundations of the cabin. Silas flinched violently, a choked sound escaping his lips. Without thinking, Alara began to sing. It was a simple vesper, a Latin hymn she had sung 1,000 times in the convent chapel. Her voice, and used for so long, was a little shaky at first, but it grew stronger, filling the small, tense space with a melody of pure, uncomplicated peace. It was a sound that had nothing to do with war or judgment or fear. O lux beata Trinitas, et principalis unitas. Slowly, incredibly, the rigid terror began to leach out of Silas's posture. His ragged breathing steadied. His eyes, which had been staring at ghosts in the rain, slowly came back into focus. They found her. He looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time, this pregnant ex-nun singing a hymn to him in the middle of a thunderstorm, chasing away the demons of a war he could not escape. The hymn ended. The only sound were the rain and the fire. "The artillery," he said, his voice raw. It sounded like the guns at Cold Harbor. Alara simply nodded. She didn't offer empty platitudes. She didn't say she understood, because she knew she couldn't. She just stood there, a witness to his pain, offering the only solace she had, her presence. He slid down the wall until he was sitting on the floor, his head in his hands. The moment of crisis had passed, leaving a devastating exhaustion in its wake. Alara retrieved his rifle and leaned it carefully against the fireplace. She poured a cup of water from the bucket and knelt beside him, offering it to him. He took it, his hand still shaking, and drank. "Thank you," he rasped. "You are welcome, Silas," she replied, using his name for the first time. In the flickering light of the lamp, they were no longer the fallen nun and the war-torn chaplain. They were just Alara and Silas, two damaged souls sheltering together from a storm, both inside and out. The walls of his fortress had been breached not by an enemy, but by an act of quiet, unexpected grace. And in that moment, the fragile truce between them began to transform into something far more profound, the tentative, unspoken beginnings of trust. As the weeks bled into autumn, the prairie grasses turning from green to gold, life on the homestead found its own quiet cadence. The garden Alara had resurrected yielded a small but precious harvest of beans, squash, and hardy greens. She learned the rhythms of Silas's solitude, the times he needed to be left alone with the ghosts that walked beside him in the daylight. He, in turn, grew accustomed to her presence, to the scent of baking bread that now sometimes filled the cabin, to the sight of her sitting in the evening lamplight, her hands busy with some mending task, her belly a gentle, growing curve beneath her dark dress. They spoke little, but their communication deepened in other ways. He would leave a bucket of fresh well water on the porch for her each morning. She would leave a hot plate of food for him when he came in late from the fields. He once found a small clutch of prairie flowers, their petals a defiant blue against the browning landscape, tucked into a jar on the table. He said nothing, but he didn't remove them, and they stayed there until they withered. One afternoon, as she was hanging laundry on the line he had strung for her between two posts, she began to hum. It was an old folk tune, one her mother used to sing. She thought she was alone, but Silas was in the barn, sharpening an axe blade, and the sound drifted in through the open door. He stopped his work, his hands still on the whetstone, and just listened. Her voice was clear and true, filled with an unadorned melancholy that seemed to speak of everything she had lost. He felt a pang in his chest, a strange, protective ache that had nothing to do with duty. He was beginning to see the woman beneath the story the town had created for her. He saw her strength, her quiet dignity, the fierce love she already held for the child she carried. He was beginning to fear not for his reputation, but for the day this fragile peace might be shattered, for the thought of her having to face the world alone again. The outside world, however, had not forgotten them. The town's resentment simmered. Silas found his credit at the general store had been mysteriously revoked. The blacksmith, a man he'd known since boyhood, was suddenly too busy to shoe Jerusalem. They were attempting to isolate him, to starve him out, to make him pay for his defiance. The pressure came to a head in the form of Reverend Miller. He arrived one crisp October morning, his buggy looking severe and out of place against the wildness of Silas's land. Silas saw him coming from a long way off and met him on the porch. He told Alara to stay inside. "Silas," the Reverend began without preamble, his face a mask of grim piety, "I have come as a friend to counsel you. The town is disturbed. The congregation is scandalized. You are harboring a sinner, a woman who has broken her sacred vows to God." "She broke her vows to an order, Reverend, not to God," Silas countered, his voice flat. "There's a difference. Do not play with semantics." Miller's voice rose, sharp and impatient. "She carries the fruit of her sin for all to see. By giving her shelter, you condone her actions. You are becoming a party to her disgrace. You, a man who once carried the Lord's word onto the battlefield." "I saw what men do on battlefields, Reverend," Silas said, his eyes going cold and distant. "I saw what they do in the name of God, and in the name of country, and in the name of righteousness. I've lost my taste for judgment." Miller's face hardened. This was not going as he'd planned. "The church council has met. We cannot stand by and allow this moral contagion to fester in our community. If you do not send this woman away, we will be forced to take action. You will be formally censured." shunned. No decent person in Redemption Gulch will trade with you or speak to you. You'll be an outcast. I've been an outcast since I came home from the war, Silas said with a humorless smile. Your threats are a little late. Frustrated, the Reverend played his final card. And what of her? What a child. Do you think this is a life for them? To be raised in shame, outside the grace of God and community? If you truly cared for her, you would send her away, somewhere she might have a chance to repent and be cleansed. The words hung in the air, cruel and sharp. If you truly cared for her. The threat was no longer just about Silas. It was about Alara and her baby. The Reverend was suggesting that Silas's protection was, in fact, another form of harm. Miller, seeing he'd struck a nerve, pressed his advantage. Think on it, Silas. For her soul, and for your own. He turned without waiting for a reply, climbed back into his buggy, and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust and moral certainty behind him. Silas stood on the porch for a long time, the Reverend's words echoing in his mind. He looked at his small, struggling homestead, at the vast, indifferent sky. Was Miller right? Was he damning her to a life of isolation and hardship simply to satisfy his own stubborn defiance? The fear he'd been feeling coalesced into a sharp, painful point. It was the fear of failure. Not of failing his crop or his homestead, but of failing her. He finally went back inside. Alara was sitting at the table, her hands folded tightly over her belly. She had clearly heard every word. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a familiar, haunted look. He is right, she whispered, her voice trembling. I am bringing this trouble on you. I should go. Go where? Silas asked, his voice rougher than he intended. Back to town, so Martha Miller can pick you apart like a crow. To the next town, and the next, until you drop from exhaustion. It would be better than ruining you, she insisted, a tear tracking its way down her cheek. You are a good man, Silas. You don't deserve this. He walked over to the table and leaned on it, his hands flat on the wood. He looked at her, really looked at her, at the fear and the strength warring in her eyes. And what about what you deserve, Alara? Don't you deserve a safe place? Doesn't your child deserve a chance to be born without shame? The question hung between them. He had used her name. He had spoken of her child as a person deserving of a future. It was in that moment that she finally broke. The story she had held so tightly inside her, the story of her own human failing, spilled out. She told him of her crisis of faith, of leaving the convent, not in disgrace, but in search of life. She told him about the surveyor, about his soft words and easy promises. She spoke of her own loneliness, her own longing to be seen and loved. Her voice was not full of self-pity, but of a devastating, clear-eyed honesty. I was a fool, she finished, her voice choked with unshed tears. I believed him, and when I told him about the baby, he was gone. He looked at me as if I was a stranger, as if I was a trap he'd narrowly escaped. Silas listened to it all, his expression unreadable. He had seen men break on the battlefield, seen them confess their deepest fears and regrets in their final moments. But this confession, in its quiet desperation, moved him more than any of them. He didn't see the sinner the Reverend saw. He saw a woman who had been profoundly betrayed, first by a man's cowardice, and then by a world's cruelty. Her story didn't align with his experiences, but it rhymed with them. It was a story of a belief being shattered, of finding oneself utterly alone in the wreckage. The Reverend's words came back to him. If you truly cared for her, and Silas realized with a sudden, gut-wrenching clarity that he did. He cared for her more than he had cared for anyone or anything in a very long time. His protection was no longer about defiance or pity. It was about her, Alara, and the child she carried. He pushed himself away from the table. He walked to the window and looked out at his land, at the life he had built for himself, a life of solitude and ghosts. It was a half-life. He had been surviving, not living. Alara, with her quiet strength and her unexpected grace, had brought life back into his silent world. The thought of her leaving, of this place returning to its crushing emptiness, was unbearable. He turned back to face her. Her head was bowed, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. He knew what he had to do. It was a desperate, mad idea, born of the Reverend's challenge and the truth of his own heart. But it was the only thing that made sense. "Alara," he said, his voice quiet but firm, cutting through her grief. She looked up, her face wet with tears. "There is a way," he said, the words feeling strange and momentous on his tongue. "A way to silence them. A way to give a child a name. A shield." She stared at him, confused. "What way?" He took a breath. "Marry me." The words dropped into the quiet cabin like stones into a still pond. Alara's eyes widened in shock. "What?" "Marry me," he repeated, his gaze steady and serious. Not for what you think. Not for love or romance. As a fortress. A legal fact they cannot argue with. "My name, Mrs. Thorne." Let them whisper about Mrs. Thorne. Let them try to shun a man's lawful wife. It's a different fight. We can win that fight. He was offering her his name as a shield, his life as a barricade. It was the most selfless, most practical, most profoundly kind proposal a woman had ever received. He was not asking for her heart. He was offering to protect hers. Alara looked at this scarred, quiet man who had faced down her tormentors, who had weathered her through his own storms, who was now offering her the one thing she thought she had lost forever, a place to belong. The tears that came to her eyes now were not of shame or sorrow. They were of a hope so fierce and bright it felt like pain. She stood up, her hand on her belly, on the new life that had been the source of all her trouble and all her strength. She looked at Silas Thorne, the war-torn chaplain, and she gave him the only answer she could. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes." The decision, once made, settled over the small cabin with a strange sense of calm and purpose. The marriage would not be a matter of the heart, but a strategic alliance, a bulwark against the town's siege. Yet, in the quiet acknowledgement that passed between them, something deeper had been forged. It was a partnership born not of passion, but of mutual respect and a shared understanding of what it meant to be broken and to endure. "We'll go to town on Sunday," Silas stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. "We won't sneak in for supplies. We will walk into the church, in front of all of them. We'll have the bands posted. It must be public. It must be defiant." Alara nodded, a knot of fear and resolve tightening in her stomach. The idea of facing that congregation again was terrifying, but the thought of doing it beside Silas gave her a strength she hadn't known she possessed. She would not be the fallen nun cowering in the corner. She would be Alara Thorne, future tense, standing her ground. Over the next few days, a subtle shift occurred. The unspoken boundary that had existed between them, the careful distance of benefactor and recipient, began to dissolve. They were no longer two solitary people sharing a space. They were a unit preparing for a battle. He spoke to her of his plans for wintering the livestock. She, in turn, showed him how to use the wild mint growing by the creek to make a tea that soothed his persistent headaches. They were small intimacies, the quiet weaving of two lives into one. One evening, he found her sitting by the fire, her hands resting on her swollen abdomen. She was looking into the flames, a soft, sad expression on her face. "Are you afraid?" he asked, his voice gentle. She looked up, startled, then gave a small, weary smile. "I've been afraid for so long. I'm not sure I remember how to be anything else. But it's a different fear now. It's not just for myself anymore." She looked down at her hands. "I'm afraid they'll hate this child, simply for being mine." Silas came and sat in the other chair, a rare act of shared repose. He stared into the fire with her. "I used to wonder," he began, his voice low and halting, "during the war, I wondered if we were all just ghosts already, just waiting for our bodies to fall. I saw so much hate, Alara, for the color of a uniform, for the state a man was born in. Hate is easy. It's a fire that warms cold people. But it's not the only fire." He glanced at her, his pale eyes catching the firelight. "We're choosing to bring a life into this world, to protect it. That's a different kind of fire. It's harder, but it's the one that matters." His words were a balm. He didn't dismiss her fear. He honored it by placing it alongside the worst he had ever seen and declaring hers the nobler struggle. In that moment, she felt a wave of affection for this strange, wounded man that was so potent it frightened her. This was supposed to be a fortress. She had not been prepared for the possibility of it feeling like a home. Sunday arrived, cold and clear. The sky was a vast, unforgiving blue. Alara wore her only dress, the black wool now, tight across her belly. She had mended it carefully, and she'd brushed her dark hair until it shone, tying it back with a simple black ribbon. It was a pathetic armor, but it was all she had. Silas wore what he always wore, dark trousers and a clean, faded shirt. But he stood taller, the stoop in his shoulders lessened. He helped her onto the wagon seat, his hand lingering for a moment on her arm. It was a small, steadying pressure. The town was quiet as they drove down the main street. It was the quiet before a storm. Everyone was already at church. They tethered Jerusalem outside, the sound of the Reverend's voice already drifting through the open doors, a drone of righteous indignation. They stopped at the threshold. Inside, the church was packed. Every pew was full. Alara could feel the weight of their collective gaze as heads began to turn. The whispers started, a sibilant rush of sound like dry leaves skittering across a graveyard. Silas put a hand on the small of her back. Together, he murmured. They walked down the central aisle. It fell a mile long. Every eye was on them, on her belly. She kept her gaze fixed on the simple wooden cross at the front of the church, refusing to look at the faces filled with contempt and morbid curiosity. They did not take a seat in a pew. Silas led her to the very front, where they stood to the side, in full view of everyone. A silent, public declaration. Reverend Miller, who had paused mid-sentence, watched them with narrowed eyes. A flicker of triumph crossed his face. He thought they had come to repent, to beg for forgiveness in front of his flock. He saw their presence as a validation of his power. He cleared his throat and leaned forward over the pulpit, his voice taking on a new, fervent intensity. We are reminded today, he boomed, his voice filling the church, of the insidious nature of sin. We are reminded that it can wear the guise of piety. It can hide behind vows, only to fester in the darkness and reveal its rotten fruit in the light of day. His gaze was fixed on Alara. It was a public scourging. Alara felt the blood drain from her face. She wanted to shrink, to disappear, but Silas's hand was still on her back, a warm, solid anchor. And we are reminded, Miller continued, his voice rising, that to consort with sinners, to give them comfort and shelter, is to invite the devil into our own house. It is to become complicit, to choose the path of the faithless over the path of the righteous. Such a choice is an abomination in the eyes of God. He was speaking directly to Silas now, accusing him in front of the entire town. A few members of the congregation nodded in grim agreement. Martha Miller, in the front pew, looked positively beatific. This was her victory. The final, public humiliation of the woman she despised, and the taming of the man who had dared to defend her. The sermon went on, a litany of damnation and judgment. Alara stood through it all, feeling each word like a physical blow. But beside her, Silas was unervingly still. He wasn't looking at the reverend. He was watching the congregation. He saw the flicker of doubt in some eyes, the morbid excitement in others, the uncomfortable shifting of those who knew this was cruel but were too afraid to object. Finally, the reverend finished, his chest puffed with the effort. Let us pray for the souls of those who have strayed so far from the light. He concluded, a final, sanctimonious twist of the knife. As the congregation bowed their heads, Silas stepped forward. There will be no prayer just yet, Reverend, he said. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the silence with the clarity of a bell. Every head snapped up. Reverend Miller stared at him, aghast. What is the meaning of this interruption, Mr. Thorne? The meaning, Silas said, turning to face the congregation, his pale eyes sweeping over them, is that I have sat in this church and listened to you speak of sin, and I have a few words of my own to say on the subject. He looked tired, ancient, but his voice was steady. I have seen men commit acts in the name of God that would make the devil himself weep. I've watched boys die screaming for their mothers, their bodies torn apart by righteous cannon fire. And in all that time, I learned one thing. Judgment is a heavy thing, and I am not convinced any man on this earth has the right to carry it. He paused, letting his words sink in. He wasn't shouting. He was reasoning, his voice laced with a sorrow so profound it commanded their attention. You look at this woman, he said, gesturing to Alara without looking away from them, and you see a broken vow, a sinner. I look at her, and I see a woman who was betrayed, who was abandoned, who has faced your scorn and your hatred with more courage than I have seen in any man on a battlefield. He took a step closer to the pews. You speak of her sin. Let me speak of her strength. You condemn her for the child she carries. I will thank God for the life she has protected. You wish to cast her out. I wish to build a home with her. He turned and looked at Alara, his gaze softening. And in front of God, the Reverend, and all the cruel, judgmental eyes of Redemption Gulch, he took her hand. Miss Alara Brennan has done me the great honor of agreeing to be my wife, he announced, his voice ringing with a conviction that left no room for doubt. Her child will be my child. Her name will be my name. We will be posting the banns this afternoon. And if any of you has an objection, you may speak it to me. But I suggest you think long and hard before you do, because I will tell you what real sin is. It's not falling. It's seeing someone fall, and instead of offering a hand, you offer them a stone. A dead silence fell over the church. It was absolute. The shame in the room had shifted, moving from Alara and landing squarely on the shoulders of the congregation. They could not meet his eyes. He had held up a mirror, and they did not like the reflection. Reverend Miller stood in his pulpit, his mouth agape, his sermon turned to ash in his mouth. His power had been broken not by force, but by a quiet, irrefutable truth delivered by a man who knew the true meaning of hell. Silas, his hand holding fast to Alara's, turned and led her back down the aisle. No one moved. No one spoke. The whispers were gone. They walked out of the church, not as outcasts, but as victors, stepping from the suffocating darkness into the clean, bright sunlight. They walked away from the church, leaving the stunned silence behind them. The air outside felt different, lighter. The sun on Alara's face was a warm benediction. She was still trembling, but it was the aftershock of battle, not the tremor of fear. Silas's hand was a firm, solid presence enfolding hers. He didn't release it until they reached the wagon. He helped her up, his movements gentle. The ride back to the homestead was silent, but it was a silence full of unspoken things. The vast sky no longer seemed indifferent, but peaceful. The golden prairie was not a wilderness, but a sanctuary. Their sanctuary. When they arrived, he unhitched Jerusalem and led him to the trough for a long drink. Alara stood on the porch of the small cabin, her hand resting on the rough-hewn wood of the doorframe. This place, it was no longer just his homestead. It was their home. The word felt strange and wonderful on her tongue, even unspoken. Silas finished with the horse and walked over to the porch, stopping a few steps below her. He looked up at her, his face weary but his eyes clear. The ghosts that usually haunted their depths seemed, for the moment, to be at rest. "Are you all right?" he asked. She nodded, a real smile touching her lips for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. "I am." She took a breath, the clean, crisp air filling her lungs. "Thank you, Silas." "What you did," she trailed off, unable to find words big enough for what he had done. He had not just defended her, he had redefined her. He had given her back her own story. "I only spoke the truth," he said simply. He looked down at his scarred, trembling hand, then back up at her. "The hardest part is done." He was wrong. The hardest part, the public confrontation, was over. But the best part, the quiet, tentative beginning of their real life together, was just starting. Later that afternoon, she was in the small garden patch she now considered her own, kneeling in the dirt, gently loosening the soil around the last of the hardy greens. The work was calming, the connection to the earth a simple, honest pleasure. She felt a presence behind her and looked up to see Silas standing there, watching her. He walked over and knelt beside her, his knees cracking in the quiet. He didn't speak, just reached out and laid his hand on the earth next to hers. For a moment, they just stayed like that, two people kneeling in the dirt of their shared land. Then he slowly, tentatively reached for her hand, not the one in the dirt, but the one that rested on her own swollen belly. He didn't take it. He simply laid his large, calloused hand over hers, his touch so light it was barely there. It was a question, a request for permission. Alara's breath hitched. She leaned into his touch, covering his hand with her other one. His hand was warm and steady. Beneath their joined hands, she felt a distinct flutter, a tiny, insistent kick from the new life within her. A slow smile spread across Silas's face. It transformed him, erasing the lines of weariness and war, revealing a glimpse of the man he might have been, the man he could still become. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated wonder. He looked from their hands on her belly up to her eyes. The space between them was no longer filled with unspoken trauma or the terms of a practical arrangement. It was filled with a quiet, powerful understanding. This was no longer a fortress built for defense. It was a foundation, laid with courage and compassion, upon which a family could be built. The sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the vast western sky in hues of rose and gold. He didn't need to say he loved her. She didn't need to say she loved him. The truth of it was there in his touch, in her smile, in the shared, silent promise to the future that kicked gently beneath their hands. The fallen nun and the war-torn chaplain had faced down the judgment of the world and, in the process, had found their own quiet, unassailable grace. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. They faced harsh judgment, but someone saw their true value. Before the story unfolds, tell us, have you ever stood up for someone unfairly judged? If you believe in looking beyond the surface, hit like and subscribe.